to you.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, Blaine, and thank you everyone for being here. And it really is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Professor Deborah Epstein, my colleague at Georgetown Law. She's been such an important voice and has so much experience on the issue of domestic violence. I'm really pleased that she was able to make the time to be here with us today to talk about this really critical topic. She's been working in this area for at least 35 years and has been the director of Georgetown's domestic violence clinic for 25 years. She's also been an associate dean at Georgetown. And throughout that time, she's been advocating for survivors of domestic violence and representing women in civil protection order cases. She has a national perspective and she knows DC really well. She co-chaired the DC Superior Court's effort to design and implement its domestic violence division, which is one of the early efforts to integrate the civil and the criminal processes when you're investigating domestic violence and prosecuting it. She served for 5 years as the co-director of the court's Domestic Violence Intake Center. She also served on the NFL Players Association Commission on Violence, and she has served as a chair of the DC Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board, the director of the Emergency Domestic Relations Project, and she was a member of the DC Mayor's Commission on Violence Against Women. I won't go on because she's telling me not to go on and because this is in her bio, but I really hope that this underscores how longstanding and deep her knowledge is. And I think that's really important. If you don't know, if you haven't studied domestic violence and don't know much about it, you might not realize how much of a shift there's been over the years. For many, many years, advocates have just been trying to get police to take it seriously, to recognize it was a thing that you need to deal with, right? And those of us who've been doing this work remember that. And now there's a sense of like, wait, what do we do? Like, is this really the right response? And that's what I have been talking with Professor Epstein about. And I know she's been thinking a lot about it, writing about that, talking with people about it, along with many, many other advocates in this area. So I thought it was really important to have her here today. And I'm really grateful that we have someone with such deep DC experience and just long-standing experience on this topic. So thank you again so much for being here, Professor Epstein.
Thank you so much for having me. The work you guys are doing is just incredibly important. I'm so happy to be able to share some time with you. I have a PowerPoint because Jennifer told me to have a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen, but I think that means that you all will disappear for me mostly. So if that's true and you guys want to interrupt as I'm talking, just unmute yourselves and give me a shout. I might not be able to see hands raised if that's okay. All right, so let's see. I am screen sharing, but I'm not. Okay. Okay. All right. Can you guys see that? Yeah, awesome. So what I really want to do this afternoon, or I guess it's the evening, is talk, as Christy said, about sort of the history of our legal response to domestic violence, specifically nationally, but really specifically in DC, and how that's evolved over time, obviously with respect to policing as the focus, and then to try to do my best to present at least an initial overview of how we might reform current police response in this particular area of domestic violence emergencies. And so to do this, what I want to do is briefly first walk you through the history of some of the parallels and the intersections of the anti-domestic violence legal movement and our country's shift towards hyper-incarceration, how those things connect with each other, because I think those parallels and connections shed light on a bunch of critical issues. First, how and why anti-domestic violence activists back in the late 80s through the 90s began to demand and call for and rely more and more on the carceral state, on police, prosecutors, and prisons for solutions. And then what the contemporary data show us, which is essentially that arrest is not particularly effective at reducing domestic violence. It has a limited effect, and that mandatory arrest, like the policy that we have, the law that we have here in DC, is pretty deeply flawed as a response to domestic violence in terms of reducing its occurrence. How arrest can still be crucial in some domestic violence moments and emergencies at the same time. I think it would be incredibly dangerous for many victims if we had an abrupt end to police involvement altogether. It can be a really crucial tool for both disrupting serious violence that happens in the privacy of people's homes and in terms of giving victims the necessary time and space they need to come up with a plan for safety. And I think, I guess the overall point I really want to make is that, in my view, in the short and probably in the medium term, we have to be able to rely on some form of police intervention for some forms of domestic violence, or in our zeal to eradicate what is absolutely intolerable, which is the racism and oppression, obviously, that are inherent in the criminal legal system, we're going to leave a lot of victims behind. So my focus is, how do we do both? How do we reduce police intervention in ways that really harm citizens and families? And how do we also ensure that victims of private violence have some protection? I think there's real room to support both of those goals, but the congruence between them is not obvious or easy. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about alternatives to the current approach, which is heavily based on the carceral state. So a little bit about prevention, a little bit about accountability, but then also a reform of the mandatory arrest law. Okay, that's what I'm going to try to do today. A couple of caveats from the outset. I'm going to probably talk mostly about domestic violence through the lens of male violence against women victims. Domestic violence happens in every relationship that you could possibly have, but the data that we have about this issue with respect to policing, with respect to economics, all kinds of stuff, is almost all focused on women as victims. So I apologize for that. That's what we really know. And it's probably the most common scenario. Okay, so here's what I think it's crucial for all of us, all of everybody in this room, to understand about the recent history of the state's response to domestic violence in terms of the law. So the current anti-domestic violence movement has its roots in the larger second wave feminist movement of the late 60s, early 70s, when feminist activists and lawyers saw domestic violence as part of a continuum of gender-based oppression that we were committed to fighting against, including things like discrimination in employment and access to credit and the ability to serve on many state juries, assumptions about childcare responsibilities, all of that. And the feminist focus on domestic violence back then revealed that women were being harmed by their intimate partners at shockingly high rates in a way that was unrecognized by our society for the most part, and that virtually, as Christy mentioned, virtually nothing was being done about it. There were virtually no resources available to women to protect women and promote their safety. So this discovery led activists and lawyers to adopt a three-prong approach. I just want to really briefly say the first prong being the shelter system. And this date comes back to be really important. In 1973, the first domestic violence shelter was opened in St. Paul, Minnesota. In the next 10 years, there were 700 more. Today, there's about 2,000 in this country. It's still, we're still woefully short of shelter beds in DC and around the country for victims of domestic violence, but that's kind of where things started. And then in 1970, DC adopted the first anti-domestic violence civil statute in the country. I was 8, but I'm still really proud of that fact. It's the first one to adopt a civil legal approach to the problem. So you all may well be familiar with this law, but essentially it gives people who are victims of domestic violence protection, emergency protection. These cases take about 2 weeks to go to trial, or they used to before COVID, and you can get protection from violence, threats, harassment. You can get a no contact provision. You can get custody of children and housing determined so that people can disaggregate their lives or find other ways to be safe. By the late 80s, every state had one of these protection order statutes. And today in DC, sorry, I think this is just on top of things. That we have about 6,000 of these cases every year. So it's a pretty heavily utilized system. On the civil protection order front, in 1995, so quite a few years into that statute, the National Center on State Courts came in and did a study, and they talked to women 6 months into their 1-year civil protection order their 1-year civil protection order. We just adopted, the city council just adopted a new law a week ago. We now have a 2-year civil protection order, which is, we were way ahead of everything and then we got way behind, and 2 years makes a lot more sense to make people come back to court rather than 1. It's just not enough time to get your life together for most people. But they interviewed people 6 months in, and what they found was 61% of those who had civil protection orders said it had improved their lives significantly, and 95% said they would seek a civil protection order again if they had the whole thing to do over. It was worth doing. On the more sobering side, within those first 6 months, 8% of women said there had been repeat physical abuse despite the order against it, and 12% reported repeat psychological abuse. And we know these numbers, that 8 and 12%, are really depressed because, of course, this is somebody's there with their graduate students doing research and calling victims on the phone and saying, is everything okay? And people who are at highest risk tend to disappear or not be responsive. So a civil protection order is an important source of empowerment, an important source of protection, but it's an imperfect tool for protecting people from domestic violence overall. For many victims, it's a necessary first step for getting space from their abusive partner and some of the basic resources they need to get their life together, but it's not everything. Okay, so what you guys are most interested in is the criminal legal system, which is the third prong of this movement, in my view. So the anti-domestic violence movement starts gaining momentum and traction in terms of expanding shelter and in terms of protection order statutes getting enacted across the country. And at that point, feminist activists start to become increasingly aware of yet another gender-based disparity in the domestic violence context. And it becomes really clear that across the country, police are almost never arresting perpetrators of domestic violence, and district attorneys, here the US Attorney's Office, are almost never prosecuting domestic violence crimes. And the enormous difference between how the police and prosecutors responded to domestic violence versus how they responded to violence in stranger relationships, people who don't know each other, was really understood, I think, certainly by me and by others, as just another example of the system's discrimination against women. And activists and lawyers like me, who were primarily, though not exclusively, white women, expanded their focus beyond protection orders and started to seek reform in the criminal legal system. And the slogan underlying this effort was treat domestic violence like any other crime. You just heard that all the time in the late 70s through the 80s. And that slogan, like most, I guess, bumper sticker style messages, was pretty misguided. What we were trying to convey was an anti-oppressive feminist message that it is crucial for our society to take threats to women's safety in the home as seriously as we take all other threats to citizen safety. But I think the slogan misses at least 2 crucially important realities, one of which is domestic violence really isn't like any other crime, right? Typically, the victim and the person harming the victim are in a relationship, often in one that will last long past a specific criminal assault or threat or incident of stalking, especially if the two have children together or their lives are otherwise really linked. So it doesn't really make sense to treat domestic violence like many other crimes. And of course, as you all well know, the way we treat crime in this country is not a great model to build on. And in a demand for equal treatment on the basis of gender, the very crucial thing that got lost in the movement was the fact that the dominant model was not actually something that feminists would ever aspire to. So there were some activists and lawyers, mostly but not exclusively, women who were Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who tried really hard to point this out really early on, to convince the predominantly white leadership of the anti-domestic violence movement not to align themselves with the criminal legal system. And to the great detriment and really the shame of this movement, and I include very much myself in this, those views were largely pushed aside, and there was a focus on bolstering the criminal legal system's response that gained an enormous amount of traction in the late 80s and 90s. And so I'm going to come back in a little bit to this tension between anti-DV and anti-carceral movements in just a bit. But for now, I really just want to walk you through how did the criminal legal system's response to domestic violence evolve to where we are now? So starting with the police. So as I have said, 70s and 80s police just did not take domestic violence seriously, particularly when it was inflicted by a male against his wife or girlfriend. Back then, we know that police often didn't respond to domestic violence calls to 911. They often had policies of waiting for a set period of time before sending the police to the scene if it was a domestic violence call. Police training manuals directed officers to avoid arrest if possible, and instead encourage the parties to mediate with each other in the moment, despite the fact that one has just committed often a violent crime against the other. So police responsiveness to domestic violence finally began to change in response to anti-domestic violence activist work in the 80s and 90s as data appeared to show, later it gets more complicated, but it appears to show it did show that arrest rates were very low, and it appeared to show that arrests could be an effective response to the problem. So I want to look at DC as an example. I think that you probably all know this well, but just to refresh everyone's memory, if a crime is a misdemeanor crime is committed outside the presence of a police officer in DC, and maybe everywhere, I don't know, someone else will know better than I will, the police have a great deal of discretion as to whether or not they will make an arrest. Okay, it's guided by a statute, but a lot of discretion. And back in 1990, my clinic was, before I was there, just a year before I came, but my clinic at Georgetown and the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence did a study, and they interviewed thousands of women who had called 911 about a domestic violence problem in the District of Columbia. And they tried to look at what factors were most correlated with a police arrest. So 1990 being, I'm not talking to my students, so who now think that's like, antediluvian prehistory, but a lot of people who are calling 911 now were around then, or their moms were around, or whatever. So this is still present, I think, in the minds of many victims. Anyway, just as background, back then there were about 19,000 domestic violence calls to 911 in DC. Today it's more like 25,000. So 19,000 calls. Arrests were made in 5% of the cases. That's pretty chilling if you think you call 911 in order to get that kind of intervention from police. Of course, not everyone calls 911 to get an arrest, but 5% is way too close to zero for comfort for me. There was no arrest more than 85% of the time when the victim was found bleeding or had been subjected to a serious injury by her partner. And there was just no statistical relationship, no correlation at all between the degree of injury and the likelihood of arrest. Nothing. Two factors we found were most likely to lead to an arrest were talk back to the officer, right? That's it. Or damaged a vehicle. So if my partner keys my car, he's probably going to be arrested, but punches me in the eye, almost certainly not. So the police did not appear to be exercising their discretion appropriately in domestic violence cases, and activists used this study to go to the city council and asked them to enact a mandatory arrest law, which essentially takes discretion away from the police in DV cases, right? So now if there's probable cause to believe a misdemeanor domestic violence crime has been committed, with a couple of little exceptions around the margins, police must arrest. And that law went into effect in 1991. So we have now, in 1990, as I said, 5% arrests. This National Center for State Court study showed that by 1995, 4 years into the mandatory arrest law, police were arresting in 41% of the cases, which is really a sea change in sort of access to the criminal justice system for victims of domestic violence. Now that number is also a little skewed because what happened here is what happened everywhere where mandatory arrest was passed, which is that the police would arrive on the scene and say, okay, you have a black eye, but he has fingernail scratches on his face. You've both committed a crime. We're going to arrest both of you. So this 41% includes a lot of dual arrest cases where people inflicting defensive injuries were also arrested, and probably still have those arrests on their records today. That's not an issue particularly anymore. But laws like this, mandatory arrest laws like DC's, where police don't have discretion in domestic violence cases anymore, swept the nation around in the 90s. They're extremely common across the country, especially in urban jurisdictions, and they're often held up to be the best practice for policing in domestic violence cases. And the result really was an enormous increase in arrest rates for domestic violence. It's probably worth noting that the two groups where arrest was the biggest increase of arrest in the aftermath of mandatory arrest were white men who really had very rarely been arrested before, and women because of this dual arrest phenomenon. But I'm going to talk about the benefits and the serious drawbacks of mandatory arrest in a minute. But I want to also just talk about the prosecution system, because you really can't look, in my view, at the police as a phenomenon outside of prosecution, at least in the domestic violence world, and really understand what's going on. Am I going any? I'll just keep going. Okay, prosecution. Also not responsive to domestic violence cases back in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Around the US and in DC, prosecutors very rarely pressed charges, brought cases in domestic violence situations. And when they did, they very rarely brought the case all the way to a guilty plea or trial. And they also routinely undercharge these cases compared to stranger violence cases. So the same facts that would be a felony if it was an action committed between strangers would be charged as a misdemeanor if it was domestic violence. These cases were just reduced down all the time. And what prosecutors said when we used to go to meetings with them was, survivors just go back anyway. We have too many cases. It's just not worth our time to expend real resources on these cases. But of course, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. If you don't think the prosecutor is going to bother to go forward with the case, it's hard to decide to comply with the prosecution. The risk of something happening in retribution for your cooperation with the prosecution is very, very high. So again, DC is a pretty typical example nationwide. The data I have is 1989, so about the same time as the police data I've talked to you about. So 19,000 calls to 911, 25 cases go to guilty plea or trial in the District of Columbia in a year for domestic violence. So I went to law school. I don't have the math skills to tell you what 25 out of 19,000 is in terms of a percentage, but that is no prosecution, right? Just nobody's really being held accountable for what is overwhelmingly a problem of violence against women. And even after the number of arrests increased because the mandatory arrest law went into effect, the US Attorney's Office was still only charging cases at about 15% of the arrests, as compared to about 70% of arrests in stranger violence cases. So the difference was enormous. The reason I think of as what was an always drop policy. If at any point between arrest and trial, the victim called a prosecutor and said, please do not go forward with this case, they would drop the case. The problem with that, of course, is you cannot tell whether the victim who's calling you has a literal or a figurative gun to her head. And so it allowed those who were perpetrators of domestic violence to get out from under the criminal legal system, which was the major source of accountability. Perhaps it shouldn't have been, but it was at the time for the violence they were inflicting. So in the last 25, maybe 30, 25 years now, there have been huge changes in DC. Whoops, huge, but I got too excited and skipped ahead. Huge changes in DC. The US Attorney's Office has created a specialized domestic violence unit with specially assigned and trained prosecutors. And they have adopted a no-drop prosecution policy, which again is held out as a gold standard around the country, and now is a common policy for domestic violence cases. A no-drop policy is the opposite of what we used to have, which is if we believe we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, we're gonna go ahead regardless of what the victim says that she wants. If we've got the evidence, we're going forward. We might subpoena her, we might not have her testify. Interesting fact that's a little off topic is that the last time I looked at this, the cases where women testified for the prosecution, testified for the defense, didn't testify at all, conviction rates were exactly the same. I don't know what that says about the esteem with which we hold women's testimony in these cases, but anyway, didn't matter what they said, we're going ahead. And in 1995, so like I said, in 89, there were 25 cases. 1995, the first year of this no-drop prosecution policy, there's 4,600. Now there's about 8,000 domestic violence prosecutions a year. The charging rate went up from 15 to 68%, so it was essentially the same as stranger violence cases. So we have a criminal legal system now that is far, far more responsive to domestic violence, but the pendulum has swung from one extreme, which I find pretty shocking, found at the time pretty shocking, which was a refusal to protect women even in quite serious incidences of violence in the home, to the other extreme, where the government is committed to intervention in the form of arrest and prosecution in almost every instance that's brought to their attention. Now, I will say the US Attorney's Office has dialed back from this no-drop policy since George Floyd's murder in May. They're prosecuting fewer cases, but this, up until very recently, this was the response in DC. So where does that leave us? Now, there are, I think, some benefits. There were some benefits of these criminal legal system mandates. I've already said this, parity with stranger crimes, access to the justice system, and just this, we needed somebody, some symbolic state declaration that we care about this problem and we're not going to tolerate it. Obviously, this progress, if you can call it that, it felt like progress at the time, came at a huge price that I want to walk through, that probably you all are pretty familiar with. And I think it exists at the individual level and also at the systemic societal level. So individual level consequences include that once the police are called, whether it's the victim's calling, her kids calling, a neighbor's calling, someone on the street is calling, the victim is swept up in a process where he has little or no control. And although an early study seemed to indicate that arrest would really reduce recidivist violence, since then, 3 decades of intensive research have shown that arrest is effective at reducing domestic violence only in incidents where the people who harm are employed or of higher socioeconomic status. So the less used you are to having the police intervene in your lives, the more likely it is to reduce your future offending in the domestic violence context. But that is far from real effectiveness of arrest. And obviously, we know that there's police inflicted violence. This isn't a group I need to explain that to. People call the police and their husband, the father of their children, get harmed, killed. Sometimes they themselves are harmed by the police. In 2015, the ACLU did a study where they interviewed thousands of women who had called 911 for help with domestic violence, and 89%, huge percentage of them, reported that contact with the police sometimes or often triggered the involvement of child protective services in their lives and possible removal of children, despite the fact that the victim, by calling the police, is trying to get protection for herself and her children. Child protective service surveillance becomes an issue in their lives because of calling the police. Clearly, police intervention has huge risks for immigrants. We twice early on in the Trump administration saw ICE in the domestic violence hallway of the court at the DC Superior Court, only twice, which is not as much as other courts across the country, but they were looking for the complainants in the civil protection order cases to arrest them or to begin removal processes. So there's another huge downside of policing. And the studies that have been done seem to indicate that when you mandate criminal legal system involvement, you teach distrust, you get people have a sense of institutional betrayal, and they say they're not going to call the police in the future, which deprives them of emergency intervention when there's serious violence in their home. So arrest is no panacea in the domestic violence field, and Lawrence Sherman, who did most of the police DV studies in this country, he did the first one that seemed to show that arrest was effective. He now says that he thinks that using arrest to stop domestic violence in many situations is like pouring gasoline on a fire. So we've got to think of other approaches. And obviously there's huge societal level consequences of relying so heavily on police in the carceral state. And these consequences fall on communities of color and Black men. You guys know all about that, but I want to point out just a couple of connections between domestic violence in particular and the societal consequences of policing. Okay, so we have obviously shifted from what we had in the 30s to the 70s, where our go-to solutions for social problems was the welfare state and health, education, housing, economic support. And then we shift to the carceral state where we rely on police and prosecution and prison. And this shift, again, starts around 1973 in this country, when that moment people refer to, right, as the punitive turn. Up until then, incarceration rates had stayed pretty even, and then they increased by 500% between 73 and 2009 or 10. And what's, I think, just critical to notice is 73 is the first domestic violence shelter that opens in this country. 70 is the first civil protection order statute. These movements, if you can call hyper-incarceration a movement, this is all happening at exactly the same time. And that, I think, temporal connection got things really twisted up together. What I hope you can see from this is how there came to be the appearance of substantial common ground between the feminist, liberation-focused anti-DV movement on the one hand, and the conservative, oppressive, tough on crime push towards a more punitive state on the other. There was a congruence between these two movements in terms of time and an increasing decision that we needed to rely more on the criminal legal system. And I think this congruence led to an alliance between liberal feminists, who were, again, predominantly white, middle class, second wave feminists, and traditionally anti-feminist conservatives that otherwise it's hard to make sense of. And I just want to quote from Beth Ritchie, who is just a brilliant African-American sociologist who was a major activist in this movement at this time. And she explains it this way. She says, "We fell into a trap and our rhetoric got used against us. We said we need mandatory arrest. And the state's response was, sure, we'll increase arrests, no problem. We said we need no drop prosecution. They said, sure, we're happy to increase prosecution rates. We said we needed a law that allocates funding to reduce violence against women. And they said, sure. And then they embedded the Violence Against Women Act, which allocated unprecedented, although still small, funding to fight violence against women in the 1994 federal crime bill, which we all know is the harshest and most punitive crime control statute in the modern era. So for those of us who were part of this movement at this time, this experience was deeply, deeply disorienting. All these criminal legal system reforms were finally happening. Police and prosecutors were starting to respond to victims of domestic violence in significant ways. Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act. It was a hugely celebratory time for anti-domestic violence activists. We thought that those in power had finally gotten it and they understood and they were responding to this crucial issue of gender-based violence and this historically discriminatory failure to protect women. But in reality, in many ways, our push on behalf of victims was used to support this much larger effort to increase the reach of the carceral state in ways that few of us intended. And our language was, without intending to, I think our language was taken to contribute to the hyper-incarceration that pervades our country now. And I say this in part because I want to debunk the myth. I think it's a myth that there is a group of carceral feminists out there who are continuing to blindly advocate for increasing the power and reach of police and prosecutors based on some belief that criminalization is the solution to social problems. I don't think those feminists exist. Feminism is a liberatory movement, not a carceral one. But what feminists get upset and concerned about, rightly in my view, is evidence that we tend to treat forms of violence that are primarily committed against women as less serious than we treat other forms of violence and harm. So we get concerned when conversations about abolishing or defunding the police tend to be disproportionately focused on alternative ways to ensure safe streets and safe neighborhoods, which is what the discourse is primarily focused on, and far less attention is paid to the analogous need to ensure safe homes. It is in our private spaces that women are most at risk, and we've got to pay attention to that. So I want to just change gears and focus on where we go from here in terms of defunding or redistributing some of the funding and resources that we give to police to other organizations. So I would say virtually all of the proposals that have been put out recently, and people can correct me if you know about something else, about reducing or abolishing the police in the domestic violence world, take the form of sort of bigger picture approaches that are focused on economics, jobs, things like that, or about accountability through community-based programs. And I think these ideas are incredibly important, but they are very big picture. Right now, they're a bit abstract, and none of them really address what we do in the emergency moment. My husband, boyfriend, whatever is in the house, he is harming me and I need help right now. We've got to work on all of this. So I want to just walk you really quickly through some of the bigger picture ideas, which you probably are aware of because they don't focus only on DV, and then talk about mandatory arrest and a new possible law. Okay. So prevention, the focus tends to be on the economic connection, and redistributing some of the police budget to economics. And that makes a lot of sense for domestic violence. We know that women with annual household incomes of less than $7,500 oops, experience domestic violence at nearly 7 times higher rates than women with household incomes of 75,000 or greater. So the connection between poverty and domestic violence is huge. And these connections also exist in sort of step progression. So if you look, there's a study that looked at longitudinal data from 2008 to 2012, and they found that domestic violence rates for women living at or below the poverty level are nearly double that for women living at 101 to 200% of the federal poverty level. And it keeps going up in those kinds of steps. Okay, so there is no question that help with poverty and pulling people out of poverty reduces domestic violence. There's also a strong relationship. Again, this is just the data we have is on male unemployment, on rates of male against female violence. So men with stable employment, this is a study that looked at a 6-year period, had rates 4.7% rates of domestic violence. Men who had 1 episode of unemployment during the study period had much higher rates, 7.5%. Men who were unemployed twice or more during that period, 12.3%. So you can see the importance of money and jobs in reducing the incident prevention, reducing the incident of domestic violence in the first place. And we're instead putting all the money into policing. So we need to change our budgetary priorities, no doubt about it. I do think this is a multi-generational impact, not an immediate one. And so we need to think about what we're going to do in the here and now, but we clearly have to do some of this kind of work on prevention. And then the other big category is that people say, sorry, I've already said that. The other big focus of folks who are looking at this issue, police and domestic violence, is about accountability. And that takes the form of restorative and transformative justice programs, which you all probably have talked quite a bit about. This work is growing in California. There's some of it happening in DC, and our Attorney General's office is doing some of this with teens. And I think these efforts are really promising. But right now, because there's never been serious funding for these efforts, they tend to be quite local, quite small scale, quite resource intensive. And we need to scale them up and see if programs where people have to take accountability for their actions within their communities will help on a larger scale. But that's going to take, again, time and resources and some research about how you scale up these very, very resource and labor intensive programs. So what do we do right now with the police in DV situations if we don't want the police to intervene every time someone needs some intervention for domestic violence? What kind of policy could we create that protects victims of domestic violence, but also reduces harms that can be inflicted through over-intervention by police that results in over-involvement of every aspect of the carceral state? And I looked really hard. I've been looking at this issue on my own for a long time, and I looked really hard for in preparation for this meeting, and there is almost nothing out there proposed as a solution. I think probably you guys are all familiar with programs like Cahoots in Oregon, where they send teams out of a mental health professional and a police officer to respond in the moment. And that's fine if mental health is the problem, which it is often if you look at the overall incidence of crime, but is not necessarily a huge component of domestic violence. And so there's very little out there targeting what do we do about domestic violence. And so I want to talk to you about a proposal that assumes a continuing need for some police intervention, which some people may object to. But I hope it gives us something to discuss or build off of or reject in favor of other ideas. And I want to say that I have, like many of you probably, spent a lot of time in the District of Columbia leading and contributing to efforts to shape policy for me in the DV field. And I have found that DC is the perfect place for serious innovation and leadership for the country, because our city is small, it's administratively centralized. You can change the whole policy through the mayor's office. It's so much less complicated than a state. And so I think you guys are really in a position to lead, not only in DC, but to create leadership around the country. And so just wanted to say, so here is what I think about mandatory arrest. Right now, the trigger for a mandatory arrest, the only trigger is the relationship between the person who's harming and the person who's being harmed, right? It's just, is their relationship covered by the Intra-Family Offenses Act, the Civil Protection Order statute? If it's covered and there is a misdemeanor crime, mandatory arrest applies. If it's not covered and they have some other kind of relationship, mandatory arrest doesn't apply and the police have discretion. This doesn't make any sense. It did back then, because police were refusing to arrest as soon as they knew it was domestic violence. But now we have these weird false equivalencies. So a longtime partner who is strangled and suffers a traumatic brain injury is treated the same as teenage siblings who have some kind of minor tussle in their house, is treated the same as a tenant texts a threat to a landlord who lives in the same building. These are not the same for policing purposes, not at all the same, but the mandatory arrest law that we have in place right now treats them as equivalent. So we need to shift the trigger. If we're going to have a trigger for arrest, and I don't think we should have a mandatory arrest, but a trigger for when we should arrest, to some other factors. And I think what we really need to do is think about what situations, what factors maximize the benefits of arrest and minimize the harm. So if one of the benefits of arrest is giving the victim a secure window to create some space and get some safety, get herself together, then maybe if we've got that, maybe situations involving serious harm inflicted, high lethality indicators. There's data showing that certain kinds of assaults are high risks for future lethality, strangulation, things like that. Maybe people whose lives are deeply interconnected. They live together, they have a long-term relationship, they have children together, so it's harder to extricate. Maybe those people need a window of safety that could come from arrest more than others. Maybe the violence is part of a larger pattern of what we call coercive control. Those relationships where the violence is a piece of a perpetrator controlling all aspects of a victim's life are places where we need arrest so that there can be some other intervention and the victim can become more safe. So that's a possible factor to consider as a trigger for arrest. Will this window of safety help the victim? Another possible category for triggers for arrest are the ones that are set out in DC's probable cause statute, which folks in this room may know better than I do because it doesn't apply in domestic violence cases anymore. But other than if it's not a domestic violence case, the way that police officers determine whether or not they should arrest for a misdemeanor that happens outside of their presence, 3 of the factors are to think about: if there's no immediate arrest, may there be additional injury? Could there be destruction of evidence? Or could there be a risk that the person won't be apprehended later? Otherwise, you can not arrest and let the prosecutors and judges decide or leave it alone. These factors may work really well in domestic violence cases. So for example, if we have a simple assault, it's not ongoing, there's no history of violence, the victim is going to Virginia to stay with her mom, she's okay with that, the officers are able, so those are all examples of it's less likely that there'll be a subsequent injury if the officers can take photos of the bruises, so we're not going to destroy evidence. If the suspect lives and works in DC, so there's not this huge risk of a failure to apprehend later, maybe we don't arrest. But if there's serious bodily injury, if there's previous convictions for domestic violence, if there's previous civil protection orders, and that's a trigger for the potential for future violence, then maybe there should be a bump up in favor of arrest. But these probable cause statutory factors could be another consideration here. Let me just give you one more, and that's, as I said, we have an initial sense, at least, of what kinds of actions tend to lead to lethality, strangulation, extreme coercive controlling behavior. Maybe some of those could be a factor. I think we need to start thinking about what does the victim say he or she wants or needs. That's a tricky one because sometimes it's hard to understand what the victim wants or needs separate and apart from the control of the perpetrator, but that could be another factor to trigger: should there be an arrest or shouldn't there be arrest? If the victim says this is actually going to make things worse for me, or I don't want this, should that be counted? We don't count it now. So these are all some beginnings of possibilities for moving past what we have now, which is relationship alone is the trigger, to think about substantive factors that are data driven that could affect whether we have arrest or not. There's just a couple of other things I think that anyone who's looking at this issue should think about. One is, what kind of consultation process do you want to engage in the district to figure out which of these kinds of factors that I mentioned or other factors should we be implementing as we think about arrest? What should trigger arrest? And I would say among the communities to consult clearly are survivors and advocates, and those should come from every survivor community and advocacy community across DC to reflect a real diversity of folks. I think we should consult with police officers who will complain a lot about arrests they've made that they don't think are appropriate. And when does that happen? I think we should talk to defense attorneys who have represented people in cases that really probably shouldn't have been brought, and we should consult with prosecutors. Probably there's all kinds of other people in the community, but I think we've got to consult with folks and come up with a series of triggers for arrest. And then finally, I think we need a whole new process. When somebody calls 911 and it's a domestic violence call, we need to figure out what is this person asking for? Are they asking for emergency intervention in ongoing serious violence, or are they asking for something else? Because I listen to thousands of 911 calls well, not thousands every year, but a lot. And sometimes they're asking for something very different and they don't need or want police response. And I would say what we should be doing is figuring this out early on at the 911 stage. I think we should, if somebody says, I'm in trouble, somebody's hurting me and I need the police, we send the police. But if not, I think we should have a public-private partnership to figure out who should get sent to the scene. We can have a DV command center. Sounds really militaristic when I look at it that way, but anyway, a thing where there's MPD officers, there's people from DC Safe, which is the primary domestic violence victim advocacy group in the district, and they work the most closely with the Metropolitan Police Department. Maybe people from the Department of Behavioral Health, because sometimes these are going to be mental health issues. And so if a victim indicates some different need, the violence is over, the perpetrator's gone, that 911 call could be referred to this group who could make a decision in real time about who needs to be sent. Is it a police officer and an advocate? Is it an advocate who could help collect evidence for a civil protection order without involving the criminal system at all, but still help you get some kind of protection in the future? Should it be a mental health professional or some combination? I think, yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Last thing I want to say, whatever we do, I really hope that we include some kind of research component from the get-go. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in public policy in this area is we just try something and we don't build in funding for evaluation from the beginning. We need to try something out and then we need to see what impact it has. I think we need to provide data-driven insights so that we can continue to get a better fit, continue to improve. This is new territory for this area of the law. And I think we need that if DC is going to do something that could be a model for other jurisdictions. We need to see how well we're doing or what we've done wrong. I would say, Christy, this would be a perfect project for the Georgetown Innovating Policing Program, which is a collaboration of MPD and a research institution. We should be doing that kind of work. And I think that's it for me. I've talked a ton. I apologize for that, and hope that we can have a conversation about all of this.
Thank you so much. I think that was really useful. I have a couple of questions, but I want to make sure we open it to people. And how long do we have before we need to, I think we have a certain amount of time before we want to move on to other business things. I don't have the agenda open in front of me.
Christy, I mean, as long as we leave 10 minutes, I think at the end we'll be okay.
Okay. So I'll do the last questions.
I guess I'll start just by saying thank you for the presentation. It was really great. The one thing, and I was struck by it too, obviously I don't have anywhere near the knowledge that you do, but this was one of the things that I worked on a lot in my grad school studies was intimate partner violence. And I remember reading, I think it was Professor Leigh Goodmark's book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence.
Yeah.
And it's a great book, but I was also struck by the lack of sort of immediate alternatives to police response. So I'm just curious, you mentioned like the restorative justice programs, like what have those looked like in practice that you've seen like at least work somewhat?
So restorative justice programs are almost all outside of intimate partner violence. They almost never do intimate partner violence work. Sometimes they do with teens, but so there's really very little data about the effectiveness of those programs in these kinds of relationships. So that's part of the problem and why people aren't pointing to that as a potential success story. Although I think certainly finding, I mean, I will say my clients, I've represented probably, I don't know, many, many hundreds of low-income African-American DC residents in protection order cases. And what they really want is to be freaking apologized to and have somebody take responsibility. Sometimes they want somebody locked up. They certainly want safety, but they want that kind of accountability. The problem is their communities are destroyed as part of the domestic violence. There's this tendency to isolate the victim from the victim's family and friends. And if you don't have community, it's very hard to do restorative or transformative justice, which is really bringing the community together to hold someone accountable. So those things are not worked out well yet. It's not an area where I have an enormous amount of expertise, but we're at a very early point of doing that in the domestic violence movement through no fault of anyone. So I think it's a huge lack of funding, but we don't know that much right now. And that's why, Lee's book doesn't have a lot in terms of concrete solutions. She's got a lot about why policing doesn't work.
Yeah.
But we don't have much. That's why you guys are going to do it, right?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, thank you so much for your time. I also really appreciate the history and kind of the acknowledgement of both the feminist movement and the anti-carceral movement. I really appreciate that. I'm curious, and I also want to say that the defund movement is a movement that was really took off with the movement for Black Lives, and Black Youth Project 100 being central to that, has for the past 5+ years took a very strong Black queer feminist lens and operates from looking at gender-based violence, pretty central to the defund movement. And so there is this narrative that defund is not considering the well-being of women. And I want to make clear that that is not the case. In fact, it is the well-being and the safety of women and femme are core to the defund movement. And with that in mind, want to ask, so some of the things in that space that through She Safe, We Safe, a campaign that Black Youth Project 100 started, and other efforts, there's been some suggestions beyond transformative justice. Transformative justice is key, and one of the main ways, as well as like the community-driven programs that you mentioned. But there is this concept that you started to get into at the end around alternatives to like the 911 call. And so one that we tend to call on to, one is a Crisis Act, which is in California, which is a direct alternative. So not even going through 911, with teams who are able to like support victims of gender-based violence. And then there's also a model in Seattle, I believe, Cahoots, that is really more so towards like social programs, but there's, to my understanding, they're starting to explore more how they can incorporate DV. And so just wanted to see if you can expand a bit more to the extent you have knowledge on how those two specific or others are working, and if you think that could be a start in the forefront in addressing the calls in the first place.
Yeah, I do. I think in some ways we can build on those models. So the Cahoots program is in Oregon, and it is very mental health focused. So it's teams of a mental health professional and a police officer going, and I had just started to touch on that, but barely got into it. But the idea there is that so much violence is, or so much police intervention is really about somebody who needs a mental health intervention and not the criminal legal system. And we need to be, no doubt, we need more of that. I think with domestic violence, there's less of a, the percentage of police arrests that are really about mental health, I think is higher in the community generally than it is in domestic violence calls to the police, where it's less about a mental health problem. So I think we need something more complicated than that for domestic violence, which is why I was proposing advocates and sort of different kinds of teams. But I love the team approach. I think it's key. The crisis legislation in California says it applies to domestic violence, but everything I've read, and you may know much more about this than I do, but everything I've read says that there isn't any specific focus on how they're going to deal with domestic violence. And so my sense is that it's a broader based program, but not something that's specific to helping victims of violence in the home. So, so if it is, that's terrific. I've looked really hard for ways in which it would take into consideration how isolated people are and all of that, and I haven't seen it. But that work that you're talking about is so key and is absolutely a place of congruence between feminism and Black Lives Matter. And I don't see them as inconsistent, but I think a lot of people think that there's this a group of feminists who think it is inconsistent. I don't think so.
Thank you. If I can ask a really quick follow-up, just because it's connected. I named those two specific just because I know that there's work around alternatives. I'm wondering, so I also, in a previous life, I worked for YWCA USA, and so I've done a lot of work around gender-based violence. And one of the things that has always been, has taken me back is just knowing the amount of intimate partner incidents and violence and of gender-based violence more broadly, but also the under 50% of those survivors actually call 911 in the first place. And so the majority of survivors don't really have any resource or any solution. And so curious to know, in my mind, like the alternatives to 911 call could be a way to reach those individuals for people, particularly women of color, right, who just are not safe calling 911 and don't see that as an option. Curious to know if you have ideas about like what are other options in addition to those calls, if any.
So I don't have real ideas about that, but I am in the middle right now of a study that I'm doing with two researchers where we are interviewing African-American, Latino, and other people of color across the country, women who have survived crises and not called the police, to ask them what they have relied on and what they want. There's just not a lot of information, systematically collected information about that. Studies like that are slow. And so I can't answer that right now, but people need, I mean, what I'm seeing as an emerging theme is nothing that will surprise anybody on the Zoom call, which is that people tend to rely on their friends and family instead of system actors, but their friends and family often are alienated from them because they ask for help and then they go back to these relationships. And we know that's a pattern, we know it. But if their family then starts to pull back on their offers of help, we can't just rely on that. So I think we're going to have to do a lot more community education around how to help community members before that's going to be a viable alternative. But we've got to have that. We've got to have community-based resources. But I wish I could be more specific. But I don't think there's anything that's really out there right now that's working or not working.
Professor, yeah, just real quickly. I grew up in a community in a family where there was this experience of domestic violence, and the first response was not to call 911, but to reach out to either the local priest or the local pastor in the community,
right,
as the resolution.
Yes.
And sometimes you never knew where that ultimately ended up, but there was this hesitancy to contact either the police, but to try to resolve the issue either within the family or within the pastoral community. That's just a comment. But I do have a question and I just saw some writings today with respect to the 911 center. So if someone contacts the 911 center and then there's a referral into the community, alternative programs, what happens from a liability standpoint if there's an escalation once healthcare workers are there or some other alternative non-police are there part of the resolution, and then there's an escalation? although the call did come through the city's 911 system?
That's a really good question. I think that's probably the reason that these programs tend to be sending out teams of a police officer and some other person rather than having a 911 call be transferred to a community member. I don't know what the liabilities would be. I'm just not expert enough to tell you, but I'm sure that would have to get worked out. And I agree that the religious community is a part of who we need to intervene, both for prevention purposes with domestic violence, preventing it from happening in the first place, and also responding. Again, we need a lot more education because some people in the religious community are really helpful, and some, I would think victims would tell you, are the opposite of helpful. And there's a preservation of the relationship theme, obviously, that can get in the way. So it's complicated, but I think religious communities need to be part of this for sure.
Professor, I have a question. I was teaching at UDC some years ago, and we talked about domestic violence. You didn't talk about or mention the case that went to the Supreme Court that had to do with a lack of proper police response to domestic violence, even though there was a record of response. There was a record of the victim calling the police and police response.
Yeah.
And in that case, they talked about, I thought that case was also part of the mandatory arrest because the victim showed signs of serious bodily injury, but the police would always walk away from it. And then as a result of that case, then the issue of mandatory arrest was brought up and then also used as a law enforcement response to victims of domestic violence. But I thought in the case it also that the victim had to show some signs of having been hit or injured or whatever have you. Now, is that the case that prompted the establishment of the protection, the Centers for Families?
No, that case came later, but that case, I think the case you're talking about is Jessica Gonzalez's case, where
right.
where she called the police because her partner of many years, against whom she had a civil protection order, kidnapped their children, actually kidnapped them and murdered them. And she called the police and said, "You got to go arrest him, and there's mandatory arrest," and they didn't.
Right.
And the question was, did they have a duty of care to her because she had that civil protection order and there was a mandatory arrest law? And Justice Scalia and others said, no, the police don't have that duty. So, that's...
In some cases, and in some instances, I know here in Washington, they use some of the components of that to justify arrest or not arrest, because if there was some sign of injury or assault, an arrest was made. If there wasn't a sign of assault, then no arrest was made.
I think in the District of Columbia, in my experience, if there's probable cause, so there has to be, yes, some evidence that a crime has been committed, not only though evidence of an assault, but if they credit the victim and they believe that it meets the probable cause standard that a crime has been committed, they will arrest. And in my experience, they over arrest like crazy. I mean, there are stories of, teenage 16-year-old boy wants to borrow the family car, takes the keys, dad says no, he throws the keys at dad, he gets arrested. I mean, they're just,
Yeah. Oh, no.
I mean, you don't need the story. Yeah. But yeah.
No, thank you.
And to be fair, I think there are many police officers who feel compelled to arrest based on the mandatory arrest law in situations where they would decline to arrest happily.
Right.
They may not want to decline to arrest in all the cases. I think they should decline to arrest, but they agree that there's an over arrest policy now.
Right.
That I think was part of our feeling of, okay, you guys are never arresting. We're going to make you pay attention and arrest. And now we just need to come back to the center, or maybe off center in the other direction. I don't know.
Okay.
Somewhere on the left. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think we only have 10 minutes left. Is that right? So first I want to thank the different voices who have brought up. I think especially Sam. Oh yeah, she's still here. You know, the idea, we have to kind of move on, but just for keeping this for future reference, keeping in mind where to go from here as a commission. We can't make the same mistake as last time and not center the voices of the victims, the survivors of Black women and BIPOC women in this. That has been the problem. One of the main problems, and we can't do that again. And I appreciate the idea of talking with, clergy and things like that. But again, like and community members, I think this is what makes it so difficult. And this is part of what Blaine was pointing out too, right? That there's a lot of stereotypes and prejudices in many of these communities that can make it very difficult for, can pressure women to feel. And so and Sam's exactly right that, the abolitionist movement, modern abolitionist movement, is from Black women who were tired of having no good choices. They either incarcerate the people who are causing harm and make it worse, or they live with the harm, right? There needs to be a better way. And that's why the mutual aid and all these other things and all these alternatives are being explored now, right? And that's where we have to go. But to understand, I think we've really surfaced here how complicated that is in this particular context as compared to some of the other contexts we've been talking about, mental health and homelessness and addiction. It's more complex, and I think, or differently complex in here. And I just think that as we go forward and figure out what recommendations we make, we need to make sure that we appreciate that complexity, reject the idea that there's some tension between reducing over-reliance on policing and protecting survivors of domestic violence, and most importantly, center these voices. And I think that's one of the reasons we're going to have some voices of impacted people in DC, but really continue to center the voices of people, the people who are survivors of domestic violence in DC, who, if I understand correctly, is the reported domestic violence are overwhelmingly women of color and people of color. Is that right? Yeah. So I just want to make sure that we sort of be mindful of that as we continue on with this conversation. And I want to thank you so much, Professor Epstein, for you just that really, that great walk through how we got here and your ideas about where we need to go next.
Thank you so much for having me. The only other thing I'll add is just that I think when you talk to African-American women, women of color, about policing in domestic violence cases, I think there's a reporting of, we need policing. A surprising amount of women who would say, we need police, in part because
there's no alternative.
There's no alternative. What are they supposed to
perceived alternative?
I mean, so it's like, it's complicated. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. Good luck with the really important work that you all are doing. It's nice to meet folks.
Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left.
7, but we can.
Oh yeah,
7. I just thought it would be useful, since the commission has been on recess and we haven't even been in touch much by email over the last couple of weeks, and I hope everyone did have a great holiday. This committee has actually 2 meetings this week. There is this one at the regularly scheduled time, and then there's an ad hoc meeting on Wednesday at 11 a.m. with Council Member Allen. And I thought committee members might like to have a few minutes while you're gathered together to talk about your priorities for that meeting with Council Member Allen. It's only an hour long, and it may be the only meeting, the only time with him prior to releasing the report. So I just wanted to make space for that, for you all, to encourage you all to talk about that a little bit together.
Jennifer, I just wanted to be clear. This meeting with Councilmember Allen is a combined meeting between this committee and the Policing and Schools Committee. Is that still true?
I didn't think it was. Bethany?
Yeah, is this separate, Samantha and Bethany, from?
Samantha. So I think I know you were interested. We got connected on the email from Councilmember Allen's office, because we were communicating with them separately about a meeting. So I don't think that I don't know that there's an issue with other committee members attending, but I didn't realize that you were trying to schedule a meeting for the whole committee. So I knew that you would be in this committee meeting and have it available to you tomorrow or Wednesday. Is this something you think had other committee members, to your knowledge, plans on attending?
I mean, there's
a lot of overlap.
Most of us are overlapping. And so I just, in terms of planning, just want to be mindful that we have an hour really to talk about two different pieces of work.
Okay.
That was the impression that I was working off of.
I mean, to be honest, since it's probably our only hour, I don't know, is there a reason to limit it to, like, what if I, for example, would like to ask, what's the plan for expansion of crisis response teams? That's technically, I think, a committee 3 thing. I think it goes to everything, but let's just say like there's a question like that goes to something else. Everybody here also sits on another committee, and there might be questions coming from that committee. I don't know, are we limited to asking questions that only directly?
I don't think we're limited in terms of his perspective. I think you're only limited by time.
We're using to prioritize.
So you have to prioritize.
Can I ask Blaine? I think Blaine and maybe LaShunda, I'm not sure who would have the best sense of what he would be in the best. I don't want to ask questions that I think are important that he's in a position to answer. Do we have a sense of what information he's in the best position to actually provide that would be useful?
It's going to depend. They keep up with what's going on with the agencies under their jurisdiction pretty well, but if there's like something about a specific program, they may not have that information. I think if you're asking him what his priorities are, especially as chair of the Judiciary Committee, that's still something that's really important to know, just so that way you can think about like what recommendations to prioritize on your end. But yeah, I don't know that like if there's like a specific programmatic question, he may not be able to provide some of that information. He may be able to tell you some things about like budget priorities too and things like that if they're thinking of those, which I don't know. We haven't started thinking of ours yet, so.
One of the things that I'd like to get out of this conversation is finding out from him what are some of the obstacles to some of the things that we're thinking about. Because I think there's generally from this committee a good amount of consensus about where we want to see DC go in terms of its use or not use of police. But I think the question is, like, what is the barrier to that? Kind of like us talking to the mayor, requesting to the mayor to have community input into the new police chief. Like, just coming up with the recommendation is one thing, but finding out, like, is this going to go anywhere? And if so, or if not, why not? I think is incredibly helpful as we do the rest of this work over the next, month or a couple months. And so really getting like a political lay of the land, because from conversations that I've had with him in other budget years around police, like I get the sense that he would do a lot more, but is obviously constrained by the fact that he's only one of 13 votes. And so I think getting a sense of that lay of the land would be incredibly helpful as we're moving forward.
That is a great, I applaud you for that comment. That's a great comment to find out. Absolutely. I mean, there may be others, but I think what you just mentioned is pretty spot on.
Yeah, it strikes me that's probably the central question to ask him. I mean, what does he see as the obstacles to the kinds of reform that he wants, and like what reforms does he want? What are the obstacles to that? And then we'll learn kind of what we could expect.
I have a question for Blaine. Maybe he could answer. Where are we? Where is the district with respect to its budget process at this point? That timeline.
The agencies got their marks, I think, a couple weeks ago. Some of you probably saw the stories about some of the nonprofit service providers who are actually getting asked to cut their budgets as a result of those marks. So they're in the phase where the agency directors are going back and forth with the mayor and the city administrator to determine, whether or not they're going to meet those marks, or what they need to cut or not cut. The full budget won't be released until the end of March, so we won't have a like clear idea of like major cuts unless something leaks until probably later in the February, I imagine. But I will say that also that the revenue estimates look better, so that's a plus. So there's that. But yeah, right now it's like basically internal deliberative process.
So if we have a recommendation we're advancing in February, will the agencies allow us to look under the hood and incorporate us? I mean, I know that I didn't think so, but
no. I mean, we are actually part of a lawsuit involving Form Bs, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, having been city administrator, because we don't get access to those. So any of the internal deliberative process stuff in the mayor's side, we don't have any knowledge of.
Is there anything more that you all want to talk about in terms of the Wednesday conversation with Councilmember Allen?
So one thing is, and this is kind of a question for maybe Samantha, Lashunda, or others, do we have any questions around anything that would be required to stay in terms of police in schools? Like, are there specific contracts that are in place for a long time that like we just couldn't move? And I don't know if that even needs to be a question form. Like, we could probably ask that over email, so we're not taking up that hour. But just back to sort of the process stuff, I was just wondering if there's anything specifically around getting police out of schools that we might want to talk to them about.
For us, originally the thought was, and I'm trying to clarify it now because I see there's two emails floating around between myself and Bethany CC'd on it and Councilmember Allen's office with 2 different times being offered. So I'm trying to get some clarity. But originally the meeting was request to more have kind of get Allen's insight on what he was hoping and planning on moving forward this legislative session. He's already committed to doing some things and has been moving some things forward. And so it's more so, the idea was more so just getting caught up to speed and seeing if there's alignment, how we as a commission can echo those, that track or lift up recommendations if it makes sense for us to. I don't think he would have information in terms of contracts and things of that nature that would be helpful for us, but also okay to ask.
And I could be wrong, Blaine, to Samantha's point, would that be under, and I should know who's chairing this committee now, but the committee Grasso, I think, and Mendelson chaired jointly?
Well, it's under committee of the whole now. Yeah, it's education just got merged basically with committee of the whole. So if you have questions, you can go through me.
Oh, great.
And yeah, the DCPS contract, the security contract would be under that. And so Alan probably really doesn't know much about that part of it.
Somehow I think we'll be able to fill the hour. Between what his priorities are and what, him updating us to Sam's point, what his priorities are and what are the obstacles.
The one thing that might be good to ask is I know and this was probably a couple years ago, but this conversation that we had around, I don't know in what space anymore, but at some point the conversation around violence interrupters in schools and the laws or the restrictions that prevented them from doing that work. I know he has raised that in the past. And so it might be worthwhile to see if he's given that further thought and has any solutions to that.
That would be, yeah, I think that would be a great question. Because he might, if he has wondered that, then he may well have got the answer by now.
Since we only have an hour, could we maybe just ask him the first 15 minutes to Sultan's question? That he respond to that quickly and then move on to some of the others with respect to his priorities for the year and how we might be able to, it may be incorporated within some of the recommendations we're considering.
Mr. Bob and Chrissy, I have a process question that I'd like to ask. And it's in reference to the council and all of that too. The recommendations that get submitted from the commission to the city council, are they going to take the recommendations as the lot, or they get to pick and choose what recommendations they want to see and implemented in the police department?
They don't have to do anything.
No. You're absolutely right, Chris. I totally agree with you. They don't have to do anything. You're absolutely right. That's not lost on me either. That's why in some ways I asked the question, because there could be, say the recommendations that come from the commission would be a nice round number, a good solid 20 recommendations in terms of the what we're doing. There are 5 committees, 5 solid recommendations. Do they get the, it would seem that to me that the whole idea would be to implement the 20 recommendations, not to have them pick and choose and go through the recommendations and based on what they like or don't like. That would defeat the whole idea of the commission to me, in terms of the work that we put forward, as well as why it was put forward. Because we're looking, I thought we were looking at the system as a whole, even some intersectionality in terms of other agencies in government, because clearly that has come up in our work. But if we're going to do,
well, that's what I was thinking. Obviously, they don't have to do anything, but from my standpoint, once we have our report and our recommendation, our heavy lift starts in April. I mean, I think we have to have a strong push on what we feel very strongly about with respect to the recommendations.
Right.
If it means that we have to go council member by council member, whatever that is, I think April is a key month for us, where we have to deliver our recommendations. We have to deliver, the advocacies around our recommendations. That's, to me, is the heavy month for us.
Mr. Bob, I've been paying attention to some of the other jurisdictions that are doing this. And I don't know, and I'm not saying, I totally agree with you in terms of, if we're going to put it forward, we got to not only put it forward, we need to push it and buy it. It's ours. But some of the other jurisdictions aren't doing that. For example, the mayor and the governor of Massachusetts or the mayor of Boston, they just finished accepting the recommendations, but those recommendations came from the legislature. So that's a different process altogether. But it could be the same, because there were people who participated in that process. Even in PG County, the county executive has the recommendations. So I guess she's going to implement it, but does she get to choose which ones she wants, which ones she doesn't? Or are they going to take it in totality? So I just would, I just would like to know how they're going to do it, because I think it's important for the commission's recommendations to be considered in totality, not individually. But
they may not. We may have 20 recommendations, and we would be advocating for all 20.
Right.
Inside the council's legislative process, depending, they may only choose 10 of the 20. I mean, Blaine could bring some reality to that, but I think our report, and that's why we said submit our final report 1 April, and that during the month of April, that's our legislative push.
Right.
It would be futile to just submit a report on 1 April and then we go away.
No, you're right.
And it just sits on a shelf and nothing. So if we believe in our recommendations as the commission of the whole, then we push forward into the legislative process, into the community process, into the advocacy community process to advance those recommendations so that we're part of the conversation with respect to police reform. Otherwise, why have the commission?
Right.
Let's say this really quick, and then hopefully we can adjourn for the night. But I would just say, obviously, council can decide what they want to do with the recommendations. I would definitely advocate for the commission to push council to implement all recommendations. They appointed this commission to look at this issue like systematically. That's something that none of the council members have done. So you're bringing knowledge, expertise, and ideas that even if they've thought of, they haven't thought about it in the same depth and like manner that you have as a commission. And I think that's really important for them to understand and for you to like elevate that. So that way they understand that like, you're not looking at these things in isolation from one another, where it's like, oh, we just did this recommendation and then everything else will be fine. No, like all of these need to be put in place in order for us to get to a better place. So that's what I would say.
Another dynamic to keep in mind is that some recommendations might require legislative action, but some might require policy changes within different agencies, MPD or other agencies in the city or in the mayor's office. So that's something I think should be mindful of. That we can make recommendations to entities beyond the legislature.
All right, any other business before we adjourn? Jennifer, is there anything else?
No, that's okay. That last piece can be done by email. It's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. And I will see some of you very soon. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.
Good night.